Madeline Pierce discovered she could watch someone die and feel nothing more than mild curiosity about the color their lips turned. The realization came at 3:47 a.m. Tuesday, when her upstairs neighbor collapsed in the hallway, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and Madeline stood there calculating how long it would take for rigor mortis to set in. Mrs. Henderson was having a heart attack right outside Madeline's apartment door, her 73-year-old body convulsing against the grimy carpet of their downtown building. Any normal person would have called 911 immediately, would have rushed to provide comfort, would have felt their own heart racing with sympathetic panic. Instead, Madeline found herself observing the scene with the detached interest of a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. She noted the way Mrs. Henderson's fingers clawed at her chest, the particular shade of blue creeping across her face, the mathematical precision with which her breathing became more labored. It wasn't until Mrs. Henderson's eyes locked onto hers, wide with terror and desperate hope, that Madeline remembered she was supposed to feel something. The social script demanded compassion, urgency, human connection. So she called 911 and knelt beside the dying woman, making the appropriate sounds of concern while internally marveling at how convincingly she could perform. Emotions she didn't actually experience. "You're going to be okay," Madeline heard herself say, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound soothing and confident. But inside her chest, where her heart should have been racing with adrenaline and empathy, there was only a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to expand with each passing second. She held Mrs. Henderson's hand and felt nothing except mild annoyance at how sweaty and desperate the old woman's grip was becoming. The paramedics arrived and whisked Mrs. Henderson away, praising Madeline for her quick thinking and calm response under pressure. They had no way of knowing that her calmness came not from courage or composure, but from a complete absence of the emotional responses that would have made the situation traumatic for a normal person. As she watched the ambulance disappear into the night, Madeline realized that what had just happened wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the most dramatic example of a change that had been building inside her for months. The transformation had started subtly, so gradually that she'd almost missed it. Her grandmother's funeral 3 months ago should have devastated her. They'd been close, sharing weekly phone calls and holiday traditions that went back decades. Instead, Madeline had stood at the graveside delivering a beautiful eulogy, while feeling nothing more significant than she might feel watching a commercial for life insurance. She'd assumed it was shock, a temporary defense mechanism that would fade as she processed her grief. But the emotional numbness had only deepened. She'd broken up with her boyfriend, Trevor, without feeling sad or relieved or anything at all. She'd received a promotion at her consulting firm without experiencing joy or satisfaction. She'd watched her best friend, Claire, get engaged without feeling excited or envious or connected to what should have been a meaningful moment. It was as if someone had reached into her chest and carefully removed every component that made her capable of genuine human feeling. The most disturbing part wasn't the absence of positive emotions, it was the complete lack of negative ones too. She couldn't feel guilt about not caring. She couldn't feel fear about what was happening to her mind. She couldn't even feel frustrated by her inability to access the emotions that should have been driving her responses to the world around her. It was a perfect emotional vacuum that left her intellectually functioning at full capacity while being completely severed from her own humanity. Madeline sat in her living room after the paramedics left, staring at the bloodstain Mrs. Henderson had left on the hallway carpet. A normal person would have been shaken by witnessing someone's near-death experience. They would have felt grateful that they'd been able to help, worried about the outcome, perhaps even traumatized by the intensity of what they'd witnessed. Instead, Madeline found herself wondering if Mrs. Henderson would survive the night, and whether her death would affect the building's property values. The thought should have horrified her, but it registered only as an interesting intellectual puzzle. She opened her laptop and began researching her condition with the same systematic approach she used for client presentations at work. She read about emotional numbness, about dissociation, about various psychological disorders that might explain the hollow space where her feelings used to live. But none of the clinical descriptions quite matched her experience. This wasn't numbness. Implied emotions were being suppressed. This felt more like the emotional circuitry had been surgically removed, leaving no trace behind. As dawn approached, Madeline made a decision that would have been impossible for her pre-transformation self to consider. Instead of seeking immediate help for what was clearly a serious psychological condition, she decided to treat it as an opportunity for exploration. She would spend time mapping the boundaries of her new emotional landscape, testing what she was capable of when freed from the constraints of empathy, guilt, and human connection. The decision felt logical and scientifically sound, though somewhere in the back of her mind, a tiny voice whispered that perhaps the most dangerous thing about losing your conscience was not realizing how dangerous it made you. She thought about Mrs. Henderson lying in a hospital bed, probably alone and frightened, wondering if the young woman who'd helped her had been genuine in her concern. Madeline knew she should visit, should check on her recovery, should feel some sense of ongoing responsibility for someone whose life she'd briefly held in her hands. Instead, she felt nothing except a mild curiosity about whether her performance of caring had been convincing enough to fool the paramedics. The sun was rising over the city, painting her apartment walls with golden light that should have felt warm and hopeful. But Madeline experienced it only as a change in lighting conditions, noting how the different angles affected the visibility of dust motes in the air. She was beginning to understand that what she'd discovered about herself was far more significant than a temporary emotional shutdown. She'd uncovered something fundamental about the architecture of human consciousness, something that most people never realized existed until it stopped working. As she prepared for another day of mimicking human behavior while feeling none of the emotions that should drive it, Madeline wondered how many other people were walking through the world with their empathy switches permanently set to off. The thought should have disturbed her, but instead it sparked the first genuine curiosity she'd felt in months. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she simply gained access to a version of human consciousness that most people were too afraid to acknowledge existed. Madeline's investigation into her own psychological architecture consumed the following weeks like a fever, transforming her into a detective pursuing the most elusive criminal imaginable, her missing humanity. Approached the mystery with the ruthless efficiency she brought to corporate consulting, creating detailed documentation of every situation that should have triggered emotional responses and recording her complete absence of feeling with scientific precision. Her methodology was flawless. She exposed herself to increasingly intense emotional stimuli, from watching videos of natural disasters to volunteering at a homeless shelter, documenting each experience with clinical detachment. When a coworker's child was diagnosed with leukemia, Madeline offered appropriate condolences while internally noting that she felt exactly the same level of engagement she might have watching actors perform a tragedy on television. The performance was becoming effortless. She could manufacture tears, provide comfort, and express concern with such convincing authenticity that no one suspected the emotional void beneath her responses. The breakthrough came during a session with Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist Madeline had been seeing sporadically since her grandmother's death. Dr. Williams had noticed subtle changes in Madeline's presentation, a flatness in her vocal patterns, a quality she described as present but fundamentally absent. When Madeline explained her condition with the same analytical precision she'd used to describe market trends, Dr. Williams leaned forward with an expression Madeline recognized as professional alarm mixed with fascination. "Madeline, what you're describing sounds less like a psychological disorder and more like a neurological event," Dr. Williams said carefully. "Have you experienced any head trauma recently? Any incidents that might have affected your brain's emotional processing centers?" The question triggered a memory Madeline had dismissed as insignificant, the car accident 4 months ago. That had left her with a mild concussion and several days of headaches. At the time, the emergency room doctors had assured her that the injury was minor, but Dr. Williams suggested an MRI to rule out damage that might have been overlooked. While waiting for her brain scans, Madeline began conducting a different kind of research. She started studying other people with the intensity of an anthropologist examining an alien species, searching for signs that they might be experiencing the same emotional disconnection she was. She watched her colleagues during meetings, analyzing their micro-expressions for evidence of genuine feeling versus performed emotion. She eavesdropped on conversations in coffee shops, listening for subtle indicators that might suggest others were running on emotional autopilot. What she discovered was both disturbing and oddly validating. In a boardroom full of executives discussing mass layoffs, she observed concern flickering across faces for exactly the socially appropriate duration, before switching to business-focused determination. At Claire's engagement party, she noticed guests cycling through scripted responses, unmarried friends expressing excitement tinged with competitive anxiety, married couples sharing knowing looks that seemed more performative than genuinely intimate. Even Claire herself appeared to be playing the role of blissful bride-to-be, rather than authentically experiencing whatever emotions should accompany finding true love. The most unsettling revelation came during a family dinner where Madeline's parents announced their plan to divorce after 32 years of marriage. She watched her siblings react with appropriate shock and sadness while she felt nothing except clinical interest in their performance. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice that her siblings' emotional responses followed predictable patterns, lasting exactly as long as social conventions demanded before shifting to practical concerns about logistics and inheritance. It was as if she'd developed X-ray vision for emotional authenticity, and what she saw was a world full of people performing feelings rather than experiencing them. The MRI results revealed subtle but significant changes in her anterior, cingulate cortex and prefrontal regions, areas crucial for empathy and emotional processing. The neurologist explained that her car accident had likely caused microscopic damage affecting her emotional responses, but emphasized that the brain's remarkable plasticity meant recovery was possible with proper treatment and time. Madeline nodded and asked appropriate questions about therapy options, but privately she found herself wondering if what she'd lost was worth recovering. Living without emotional interference had unexpected advantages. She negotiated contracts with devastating effectiveness, unclouded by concerns about fairness or relationship preservation. She made personal decisions based purely on logical analysis rather than being swayed by guilt or social pressure. She slept better, ate more efficiently, and found herself immune to the anxiety and stress that seemed to plague everyone around her. The price was her connection to other people, but Madeline was beginning to question whether those connections had ever been as genuine as she'd believed. Her growing cynicism about human emotional authenticity was reinforced during an encounter with her ex-boyfriend Trevor, who called requesting a reconciliation meeting. Madeline agreed, partly out of curiosity about how she would handle an interaction that should have been emotionally charged. Trevor poured his heart out about missing her, about realizing she was the love of his life, about wanting to build a future together. His performance was convincing enough to bring tears to his eyes, and a normal woman might have been moved by his apparent sincerity. Instead, Madeline found herself analyzing the strategic elements of his approach, the carefully chosen location at their former favorite restaurant, the timing of his emotional revelations, the way he watched her face for reactions that would tell him whether his tactics were working. She responded with perfectly calibrated emotional cues, giving him just enough hope to keep him invested while maintaining enough distance to preserve her power in the dynamic. When they parted with plans for another meeting, Madeline felt satisfied in the same way she might after successfully closing a difficult business deal. The encounter with Trevor crystallized a disturbing possibility that had been growing in Madeline's mind. What if her condition hadn't damaged her? What if it had simply revealed the truth about human emotional interaction? What if empathy and genuine feeling were luxuries that most people couldn't afford in a world that rewarded strategic thinking and emotional manipulation? Maybe her accident had stripped away comfortable illusions about human nature, leaving her with the clarity to see social interaction as the complex game it really was. As she prepared for her follow-up appointment with Dr. Williams, Madeline realized she faced a choice that would define the rest of her existence. She could pursue treatment to restore her emotional capacity, returning to a world of messy feelings and irrational decisions driven by empathy and guilt. Or she could embrace what she'd become, exploring the full potential of human consciousness freed from emotional constraints. The decision should have been obvious, but Madeline was beginning to understand that the most significant choices couldn't be made through logic alone, and therein lay the fundamental problem with her current state of being. Madeline's experiment began with calculated precision. Like a surgeon making the first incision in a procedure she'd rehearsed countless times. She started with low-stakes manipulations, testing the boundaries of her newfound emotional freedom, while carefully documenting the responses of her unwitting subjects. Her assistant Rachel became the first casualty, subjected to fabricated deadlines and impossible expectations that left her working 16-hour days while Madeline observed the deterioration of her mental state with clinical fascination. The power was intoxicating in ways that her previous emotionally constrained self could never have imagined. Without empathy clouding her judgment, Madeline could read people's psychological vulnerabilities with laser precision and exploit them with surgical efficiency. She convinced Trevor to lend her $15,000 by carefully orchestrating conversations that left him feeling both protective and hopeful about their future together, knowing she had no intention of repaying the money or resuming their relationship. When he transferred the funds with tears of gratitude in his eyes, Madeline felt the same satisfaction she might experience solving a particularly complex mathematical equation. Her professional life transformed dramatically as she learned to weaponize her emotional detachment. During contract negotiations, she could remain perfectly calm while her counterparts became increasingly agitated by her refusal to engage emotionally with their pressure tactics. She fired underperforming employees with ruthless efficiency, delivering terminations in ways that minimized both their emotional trauma and the company's legal exposure. Her boss praised her newfound executive presence, completely unaware that what he was witnessing was the absence of the emotional constraints that had previously limited her effectiveness. The most significant development came when Madeline encountered David Torres at an industry networking event. David was a venture capitalist known for his ability to identify promising startups and his reputation for making decisions that prioritized profit over human considerations. As they talked, Madeline recognized something familiar in his demeanor, the same careful calibration of responses she'd been practicing, the same analytical approach to human interaction that treated emotions as variables to be managed rather than experiences to be shared. "You're different from most people in consulting," David observed during their conversation, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something of himself reflected back. "Most professionals in your field get too emotionally invested in their client relationships. It clouds their judgment." When he suggested they continue their discussion over dinner, Madeline accepted not out of attraction or social interest, but because she sensed David might hold the key to understanding whether her condition was as unique as she'd assumed. Their dinner conversation revealed that David had developed his emotional detachment deliberately through years of what he called psychological optimization. He spoke about empathy as a cognitive bias that led to suboptimal decision-making, describing emotional attachment as a luxury that successful people couldn't afford. "The market doesn't care about your feelings," he explained over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Neither do your competitors. The moment you let empathy influence your strategic thinking, you've already lost." When Madeline shared her own experience of emotional disconnection, David's reaction was immediate and intense. "What happened to you naturally is what I've spent decades trying to achieve artificially," he said, leaning forward with something that might have been excitement if he were capable of such feelings. "Most people are slaves to their emotional programming. They make decisions based on guilt, fear, social pressure, all these irrational factors that have nothing to do with optimal outcomes. You've been given a gift that could change your entire life trajectory." Over the following weeks, David introduced Madeline to a network of highly successful individuals who seemed to share their emotional detachment. There was Catherine, a surgeon who could operate on children while remaining completely unaffected by their parents' anguish. Michael, a defense attorney who specialized in getting clearly guilty clients acquitted without experiencing any moral conflict about the crimes they'd committed. Lisa, a pharmaceutical executive who made pricing decisions that affected thousands of patients without losing sleep over the human cost of denying people access to life-saving medications. As Madeline spent more time with this group, she began to see them as a kind of evolutionary advancement, humans who had transcended the kalai, emotional limitations that held most people back from achieving their full potential. They weren't monsters, she told herself. They were simply more efficient, more rational, more capable of making the difficult decisions that moved society forward. Someone had to be willing to do the jobs that required emotional distance, to make choices that empathetic people couldn't handle without being paralyzed by guilt and second-guessing. The group's influence on Madeline's behavior became apparent during a consulting project with a small family business facing bankruptcy. The company employed 37 people, most of whom had worked there for over a decade and considered their colleagues family. Madeline's analysis revealed that the business could be saved through a restructuring that would require laying off 22 employees. But she also identified an acquisition opportunity that would be more profitable for her firm while guaranteeing the complete closure of the family business. Her pre-accident self would have recommended the restructuring plan, driven by empathy for the employees and respect for the family that had built the business over 3 generations. Instead, Madeline presented the acquisition option with compelling financial projections and strategic arguments that made the decision seem obvious. When the family patriarch broke down crying as he signed the papers that would end his life's work and destroy the livelihoods of people he'd known for years, Madeline felt nothing except professional satisfaction at having maximized her firm's profit margin. The most disturbing aspect of her transformation wasn't the absence of guilt about her actions. It was her growing contempt for people who allowed emotions to influence their decisions. She watched Rachel struggle with anxiety attacks brought on by the impossible workload Madeline had created, and instead of feeling concerned, She felt annoyed that Rachel lacked the psychological fortitude to handle pressure more efficiently. When Trevor called crying about financial difficulties that made it hard for him to repay the loan she knew he would never see again, Madeline felt nothing except mild irritation at his emotional weakness. Her month-long experiment was approaching its conclusion, and Madeline found herself facing a decision that would determine not just her future, but her fundamental identity as a human being. She could seek treatment to restore her emotional capacity, returning to the messy, inefficient world of empathy and human connection. Or she could embrace what she'd become, joining David's network of emotionally optimized achievers and discovering how far this new version of herself could ascend without the dead weight of conscience holding her back. The choice seemed obvious from a rational perspective, but Madeline was beginning to suspect that some decisions transcended logical analysis. As she prepared for what might be her final meeting with Dr. Williams, she wondered if the most dangerous thing about losing your empathy wasn't the harm you could do to others. It was the possibility that you might never realize how much you'd lost of yourself. The moment that shattered Madeline's carefully constructed emotional vacuum came during what should have been a routine presentation in David's glass-walled conference room. Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric oncologist, was pitching breakthrough treatments for childhood cancer that could save thousands of young lives. But as Madeline listened to David and his associates discuss the research, she realized they weren't seeing dying children. They were calculating profit margins on human suffering with the casual efficiency of accountants processing invoices. The mortality demographics actually work in our favor, Michael noted, clicking through financial projections with disturbing enthusiasm. Terminal diagnoses create desperate parents who'll pay any amount for hope, regardless of treatment efficacy. Madeline watched Dr. Foster's face crumble as she understood that her life-saving research was being evaluated purely as a revenue opportunity. The moment should have meant nothing to Madeline's emotionally disconnected consciousness, but something unprecedented happened. A tiny electrical spark in the darkness where her empathy used to live. The spark intensified when David suggested maximizing profits by creating artificial scarcity, limiting access to treatments that could save children's lives. "We're not operating a charity," he said with the slight smile that had once seemed sophisticated but now struck Madeline as grotesque. "The objective is return on investment, not rescuing every terminally ill child on the continent." Dr. Foster tried to protest, her voice breaking as she explained that her entire career had been devoted to helping children who were dying. But her words were quickly buried under discussions of patent protections and market manipulation strategies. Madeline found herself staring at a photograph in Dr. Foster's presentation. Materials: a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who had been among the first successful test subjects for the new treatments. The child's face radiated hope and trust, exactly the kind of image that would have triggered overwhelming emotion in her previous life. But now, listening to the group casually discuss pricing strategies that would put Emma's treatment beyond the reach of most families, Madeline felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The uncomfortable recognition that what they were planning was fundamentally, irredeemably wrong. The sensation was subtle initially, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse slowly remembering its function. But as the meeting continued and the group's callousness became more apparent, Madeline began to feel something that might have been the earliest whispers of conscience reawakening. It wasn't the overwhelming emotional flood she remembered from her previous existence. It was more like a quiet internal alarm system coming back online, sending gentle but persistent signals that she was witnessing something that violated basic human decency. After the meeting ended, Madeline found herself following Dr. Foster to the parking garage, though she couldn't articulate why her feet were carrying her away from the conference room. When she caught up with the researcher, she discovered tears of frustration and betrayal streaming down her face. "I thought they would understand," Dr. Foster whispered when Madeline approached. "I believed that if I could explain how many children this could save, they would see beyond the financial projections." For the first time in months, Madeline felt compelled to offer comfort that wasn't calculated or strategically motivated. "I'm sorry," Madeline said, surprised to discover she actually meant the words. "They should have listened to what you were really saying." The apology felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd almost forgotten existed. Dr. Foster looked at her with surprise, perhaps sensing something genuine in Madeline's response that had been absent during the meeting. They talked for 30 minutes in that concrete parking garage, and with each exchange, Madeline felt more of her emotional circuitry slowly, painfully coming back to life. That night, Madeline couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Emma's photograph, about Dr. Foster's tears, about the casual cruelty she'd witnessed from people she'd been considering her intellectual peers. For months, she'd convinced herself that emotional detachment represented evolution, a more efficient way of functioning in a complex world that rewarded strategic thinking over human sentiment. But seeing the human cost of that detachment displayed so starkly had triggered something she thought had been permanently severed. She began reviewing her recent behavior with growing horror, like watching surveillance footage of crimes committed by someone wearing her face. She remembered Rachel working herself into exhaustion on fabricated deadlines, crying at her desk from stress that Madeline had deliberately created. She thought about Trevor, still sending hopeful messages based on the false encouragement she'd given him while planning to keep his money. She recalled the family business she'd helped destroy, the 37 people whose livelihoods she'd sacrificed for a slightly better profit margin. The realization that she'd become capable of such calculated cruelty should have devastated her, but instead felt like the first step toward reclaiming her humanity. The very fact that she could feel horrified by her own actions meant that whatever neurological damage her accident had caused wasn't irreversible. Her empathy hadn't been destroyed, it had been temporarily severed, and now it was slowly rebuilding the neural connections that made her capable of genuine moral reasoning. Over the following days, Madeline began the delicate process of reconnecting with her emotions. She started cautiously, allowing herself to feel authentic concern when she noticed her elderly neighbor struggling with grocery bags. She practiced genuine gratitude when a barista remembered her coffee order and added a smile. She permitted herself to experience real disappointment when a project at work didn't meet her standards. Each emotion felt fragile and unfamiliar, like learning to walk again after months of paralysis. The most difficult part was confronting the people she'd hurt during her experiment. She called Trevor and had a brutally honest conversation about her condition and the financial manipulation she'd subjected him to. She stayed late to help Rachel recover from the artificial crisis Madeline had created, admitting that many of the urgent deadlines had been unnecessary psychological experiments. She reached out to the family whose business she'd helped destroy, offering to provide consulting services free of charge to help them rebuild their lives. But the most significant change came in her relationship with David's network. When he invited her to another investment meeting focused on exploiting medical patents to maximize pharmaceutical profits, Madeline declined, explaining that she was seeking treatment for her condition. David's reaction was revealing. He seemed genuinely confused by her decision, unable to comprehend why someone would voluntarily return to emotional vulnerability after experiencing the power that came with complete detachment. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," David told her, his voice carrying the same cold calculation she'd once found impressive. "Emotions will destroy your potential, turn you back into just another person making irrational decisions based on sentiment and guilt. You have the opportunity to join something extraordinary, to become part of a group that understands how the world really works." But as Madeline listened to his arguments, she realized that David and his associates weren't evolved humans who had transcended emotional limitations. They were people who had become so disconnected from their humanity that they'd forgotten why human connection mattered. They could succeed in narrow professional terms, accumulating wealth and power through strategic manipulation and calculated cruelty. But they were failing as human beings in ways they couldn't even recognize, because they'd lost the capacity to understand what success really meant when measured against the full spectrum of human experience. As her empathy continued to return, Madeline understood that what she'd experienced wasn't a gift to be embraced or a curse to be overcome. It was a warning about what humans could become when they severed the emotional connections that made moral reasoning possible. 6 months after her emotional awakening began, Madeline stood in Dr. Williams' office facing a decision that would determine not only her future, but her fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. The MRI scans spread across the desk showed remarkable neuroplasticity. Her brain's emotional processing centers were rebuilding themselves with unprecedented speed, creating new neural pathways to replace those damaged in her accident. But the recovery had reached a critical juncture where Madeline could actively influence the final outcome. "You have 2 distinct paths ahead of you," Dr. Williams explained, pointing to highlighted regions on the brain scans. "We can accelerate your complete emotional recovery through intensive therapy and targeted medications, restoring full empathetic capacity within 4 to 6 months. Alternatively, you could allow the healing to continue at its natural pace, which would leave you with something unique: enhanced emotional control, where you could access feelings when you chose to, but also disconnect when circumstances demanded it." It was, essentially, the choice between becoming fully human again or retaining the ability to switch her empathy on and off like a light. The decision should have been straightforward, but Madeline found herself genuinely torn in ways her detached self never could have experienced. Over recent weeks, she'd felt both the profound relief of reconnecting with people she cared about and the practical advantages of being able to emotionally disconnect when situations threatened to overwhelm rational decision-making. She'd successfully negotiated a major promotion at work without being paralyzed by anxiety about rejection. But she'd also cried genuine tears of joy when Claire announced her pregnancy. It was like possessing a superpower with terrible moral complexity, useful, but potentially catastrophic if misused. The complexity of her situation became clear during a conversation with her mother, who had noticed subtle changes in Madeline's behavior over recent months without understanding their cause. "You seem different, sweetheart," her mother said during their weekly call. "More focused and decisive, but also, I don't know how to explain it, less present emotionally. Like you're observing your own life instead of living it." Madeline realized her mother had detected something that even her closest friends had missed: the difference between performed emotion and authentic feeling, between strategic empathy and genuine human connection. Madeline decided to share her complete story with the people who mattered most to her, beginning with Claire. They met at the coffee shop where their friendship had began years earlier, and Madeline explained everything: the accident, the emotional disconnection, the experiments she'd conducted on unsuspecting victims, and the choice she now faced. Claire listened with growing alarm, particularly when Madeline described her involvement with David's network and the pharmaceutical meeting that had triggered her moral awakening. "Madeline, you're talking about choosing whether to keep your humanity intact or not," Claire said, her voice shaking with emotion that Madeline's enhanced empathy could now fully appreciate. "That's not a decision anyone should have to make, but it's also not one you can base on convenience or professional advantage. The fact that you're even considering maintaining the ability to turn off your empathy tells me you haven't fully grasped what you lost when it was gone." Claire's words stung because they contained a truth Madeline had been avoiding. Part of her remained attracted to the power that came with emotional detachment. That evening, Madeline called Dr. Foster, the researcher whose tears in a parking garage had begun her journey back to humanity. They'd maintained contact since that pivotal day, and Madeline had been following the progress of her childhood cancer treatments. Dr. Foster had found new investors who were committed to making the therapies accessible regardless of families' ability to pay. When Madeline asked what had convinced these new backers to prioritize humanitarian concerns over profit maximization, Dr. Foster's answer was devastating in its simplicity. They had children of their own. They couldn't look at photographs of dying kids without seeing their own sons and daughters. The conversation crystallized something Madeline had been struggling to understand about the nature of moral reasoning itself. Empathy wasn't just about feeling good or maintaining social connections. It was the foundation upon which ethical decision-making was built. The investors who chose to help dying children weren't making that choice despite their emotions. They were making it because of them. Their ability to imagine their own children in similar circumstances to feel the parents' desperation and terror was what enabled them to see beyond financial projections to fundamental human needs. Madeline realized that during her months of emotional detachment, she hadn't become more rational, she'd become incapable of recognizing what true rationality meant in human terms. A genuinely rational decision about pharmaceutical pricing would consider not just financial returns, but the human cost of denying life-saving treatments to children. A truly logical approach to business relationships would account for the long-term value of trust and mutual respect, not just immediate tactical advantages. Empathy wasn't the enemy of good decision-making. It was an essential component that prevented intelligence from becoming mere calculation. The final factor in Madeline's decision came from an unexpected source: Trevor. Despite everything she'd put him through during her experiment, he'd continued reaching out with genuine concern for her well-being rather than resentment about the money she'd stolen. When she called to make a more complete apology, he surprised her by saying he'd noticed the difference in her voice before she'd even mentioned her condition. "You sound like yourself again," he said with warmth that her restored empathy could finally appreciate. "Not exactly like before, more like a stronger version of who you always were. Someone who's survived something terrible and emerged wiser." Madeline scheduled her follow-up appointment with Dr. Williams and made her choice with the clarity that only comes from understanding the full consequences of the causes of the Funson alternatives. She would pursue complete emotional recovery, accepting both the vulnerability and the strength that came with full empathetic capacity. The decision felt right in a way her emotionally detached self could never have recognized, not because it was strategically optimal, but because it honored the full complexity of human experience and moral responsibility. 8 months later, Madeline stood in the same parking garage where Dr. Foster's tears had begun her journey back to humanity, watching a mother comfort her frightened child before a medical appointment. The scene that would have meant nothing to her during her detached period now filled her with warm recognition of universal human bonds and the fundamental importance of offering comfort during moments of vulnerability. She felt grateful for the accident that had temporarily severed her empathy, because losing it had taught her exactly why it was worth preserving. Madeline's experience had revealed something most people never discover: that the capacity for genuine human connection isn't a weakness to be overcome or a luxury to be discarded when inconvenient. It's the foundation of everything that makes existence meaningful, the source of both our greatest vulnerabilities and our most profound strengths. She'd learned that the empathy switch exists in everyone, and the choice of whether to use it isn't just personal, it's moral, it's essential, and it defines who we choose to become when tested by circumstances that reveal our true character. Her journey had shown her that intelligence without empathy becomes mere calculation, that success without conscience becomes exploitation, and that power without compassion becomes tyranny. The switch that controls human empathy isn't just a neurological mechanism, it's the difference between being a highly sophisticated machine and being genuinely, completely, courageously human. If Madeline's transformation from emotional darkness back to authentic humanity resonated with you, There are countless other stories exploring the psychology of human nature, moral complexity, and the power of choice waiting to be discovered. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that our capacity to care is what separates us from sophisticated machines. Subscribe for more deep psychological explorations, and let us know in the comments about a time when you had to choose between convenience and compassion, because the most important conversations often begin with stories that challenge us to examine our own moral boundaries. Your engagement helps these meaningful narratives reach the people who need them most.